Welcome to the Fritz Roethlisberger Memorial Award session, which is also being recorded for the Journal of Management Education podcast series. I'm Nick Rue, and I'm an associate editor for the Journal of Management Education for podcasting. I'm thrilled today to be joined by Rachel Clapp-Smith, Michelle Hammond, Michael Palanski, and Gretchen Lester, to discuss their paper titled Promoting Identity Development in Leadership Education, a Multidomain Approach to Developing the Whole Leader. Rachel is a professor of leadership and interim associate vice chancellor in academic affairs and academic director of the Leadership Institute at Purdue University Northwest. Michelle Hammond is an assistant professor of management at Oakland University and co-director of their Leadership Academy. Michael is the professor of management in the Saunders College of Business at Rochester Institute of Technology and owner of Empower to Lead, a leadership coaching and consulting practice. And Gretchen is an associate professor in the School of Management at San Jose State. Just a word before we welcome everyone else that the Roethlisberger Award is co-sponsored by MOBTS and Sage Publication, and it commemorates Fritz Roethlisberger and his passionate devotion to inquiry and learning. It's granted each year to the best paper from the Journal of Management Education for the preceding year, after a thorough review this year chaired by Kevin Lowe, and with the work completed by a whole host of reviewers. Today's session should flow like an informal interview. I've prepared several questions along with the authors, but I also encourage each of you participants, if you have a question you'd like asked, to submit it in the chat box, and I'll sort of moderate those as they come in. Also throughout the session, please do keep your microphone muted as we are recording this for a podcast. So Rachel, Michelle, Gretchen, Mike, thank you all for joining. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
So to get started, just for folks, hopefully this isn't the case. Hopefully everyone has read the paper already. But just in case they haven't, I'm wondering if you could provide maybe a brief overview of what you've done here.
Sure. I'm going to take this one. So the article summarizes 5 in-class exercises that really aim at getting identity work for leadership education. So when we talk about identity work, what we're really trying to get at are the 4 elements of leader identity that are covered in the Hammond et al. 2017 article. And so those 4 pieces are meaning of leadership, strength of leader identity, the different levels of identity, and then integration of the leader identity across different life domains. So those are all covered in that particular article. And so we have an exercise for each one of those dimensions of leader identity. And then the 5th exercise is a way to pull all of those reflection tools together to craft a leadership story or narrative, so that by the end of implementing these exercises, the student should walk away with a pretty clear idea of what their leader identity is, what their story is, and how to tell it.
And then I just would like to add on that not only do we explain the exercises in the manuscript, we also include a table which has step-by-step instructions, and also a list of our most heavily researched leadership theories and concepts that kind of fit with all of the facets of leader identity. So that can help an instructor tie leader identity to the broader leadership field and the topics that students are learning about in their textbooks or through other outside readings.
Rachel, you mentioned the 2017 work in Academy of Management Review, and I think the theoretical grounding in this article is one of my very favorite aspects of it. And I have a couple of questions around that. First, what inspired you to go this multi-domain route, this approach to leadership as bringing in kind of all facets of the individual? What was the inspiration for that theory work? And then 2, I'm wondering if you can elaborate on the process for translating that theory work for the AMR paper to the classroom and to JME, because I think it's a fantastic model for authors to join.
Well, I'll tell the story of how this came to be. Since I love this story. It was probably 8 or 9 years ago, and my friend James Avey, who's at Central Washington, was here at RIT doing a research talk, and the calendar worked out such that he had most of a day before he had to fly back. And he said, I've never seen Niagara Falls. Could we drive over there? Well, this was like the beginning of March, or as we call it in Rochester, the middle of winter. But I'm like, hey, if that's what you want to do, that's great. So we went over, we jumped out of the car. He looked, he's like, yep, that's pretty cool. And we got back in the car. All right. But on the way back, since we had so much time to kill, I said, hey, as the second prize, I'll take you to the birthplace of the Buffalo Wing, which is the Anchor Bar in Buffalo, New York. So we go into the Anchor Bar, and we're having a beer, waiting for our wings to come out, doing a little noon drinking there. And he's a leadership researcher as well. And we started talking, and I said, why is it that we only ever look at leadership and leadership development at work? Because think about it. Most of the lessons that we know about leadership, we've learned in some other area of life, whether it was earlier in life or something that we're volunteering or as parents or whatever. And we literally took a bar napkin from the Anchor Bar, which I wish I still had, because this would just make the story so much better. And we sketched up what would eventually become this model. Soon after, we tried to include all of our friends, and James was cohort mates in his PhD program with Rachel and actually with Gretchen. And so we got all of our friends together, and for one reason or another, people kind of dropped off, and as it changed and everything, until it was just Rachel and I at one point. But then one of the people who dropped out knew Michelle very well and said Michelle would be all over this. And Michelle and I had worked together previously, and we got on a call, and I'm like, hey, Michelle, I have a question. She's like, yeah, I'm in. And that's what led to the AMR. And about the time the AMR was being published, Gretchen was coming back into academia, and we were able to bring kind of her into the fold, and we've been working on it ever since.
That's fantastic.
That's how it happened.
Oh, that's great. So what about the translating that work to JME, to the JME audience, into the classroom?
Michelle, unmute.
Oh, sorry about that. I can take it. So I guess, as Kurt Lewin is attributed to saying, there's nothing so practical as good theory, we really wanted to put that to the test. And I think even in Mike's telling of the story about how the concept came to be, there's an implication for doing something about that. I think we've all had students, had experiences with, neighbors and coworkers and friends that, maybe really want an opportunity to lead or to develop themselves, but haven't been given the opportunity in work, or potentially work is a little too risky for them to try new things because of the constraints or whatnot. So we really wanted to test the theory out. We thought a lot about the student sample as being actually quite ideal in a lot of ways. When you get ready to go to college, you write a personal statement about all the extracurricular activities that you've done to build your leadership. And potentially they haven't had a lot of formal opportunities in work. So it's kind of the flip, actually. So we spent a lot of time kind of thinking about that. And devised the exercises, not only for undergraduate students that are almost preaching to the choir, but especially in MBA students. It works really well with. We were talking a moment ago about how Kevin is excited about using it in the context of EMBA students that have had a lot of formal leadership, but maybe kind of forget about all of those other aspects of life that are, potentially even outside of their own awareness, building their own leadership capacity. So we really devised those to kind of put that to the test. And the theory itself is a sense-making approach. So we thought that the educational environment's a really great one for getting people to think about these things, for noticing these connections and disconnections across their areas of life.
Terrific. You mentioned a couple of different student groups that you've used these exercises with, and I'm curious if you could speak more about maybe some of the other variations you use between undergraduate and graduate students, or the difficulty of, or maybe a bit more about the difficulty of getting MBA students to look beyond their work lives some of these sorts of variations or challenges that you've had with these exercises with these different student groups. I'm wondering if you could chat a bit more about those.
I'll take this one. A few of the limitations that come up across the type of students we have sometimes is the resistance to doing the work. A lot of times we'll get students who resist the process of personal reflection, or they just want to get it done quickly, so they don't really think about and ruminate on how these activities or experiences have shaped them into the person they've become. You know, a lot of times they just don't want to spend the time or effort required to go through that noticing and interpretation process. But one thing we found that works is to help the students generate a dialogue amongst themselves. So it's not us telling them this is important for you, but allowing them to have a discussion with similar students or people from very different backgrounds that spurs on that thinking. So for one example, in the drawing exercise, I might pair up a student who has illustrated a more directive leader with a student who has illustrated a more teamwork type of leader, and then to have them talk about why their drawings look so different and where that implicit theory is really coming from for them. A second limitation can really be the personal nature of identity work. Sometimes personal sharing is difficult in specific situations or with different cultural backgrounds. So I always recommend to my students that if they don't feel comfortable sharing something that's very personal to them, they can create a dialogue just specifically with me. And I will certainly keep that anonymous and confidential for them. Or sometimes to even have them do the work on their own, and then they could redact out pieces of it and submit something that's not as maybe, you know, to kind of give them the sense that they're not sharing too much personal information.
Yeah, this is interesting. I could see that being very challenging, especially in a business school where some of the expectations for arm's length, maybe we should say, continue to be set, especially in other areas of the business school. So I could see stepping away from that, which is a problem we have in the host of a whole bunch of, or in the face of a whole host of OB topics as well, right? Is getting them to be okay with that personal sharing. And so I wonder if I have just another question or two, and then we'll open it up to the other participants. Hopefully, other folks in the session are thinking of questions you'd like to ask of these authors. But in the context of these limitations, I guess too, is I have a question about logistics, because this issue of timing comes up a couple of times, and I notice in at least one of the student comments they discussed doing one of the exercises or part of one of the exercises on day one. But then there is kind of a sequence implied, but so I'm kind of wondering about timing and how you've experimented with timing, and maybe how that relates to overcoming some of these challenges. But wondering if you could just share a bit more about your experiences with experimenting around the timing of the different exercises.
Yeah, that's a great question. So thank you for bringing that. The issue with identity work is, or maybe in the academic world, we try to make things into linear processes that simply are not linear, right? So the sense-making process is not something that happens in the linear fashion that our beautiful model in the AMR would suggest it does. It is kind of important to remind students of this during teaching of it. And similarly, the exercises can build upon each other, and how you time it really does depend on the format of the course or the type of course. So the first time I taught it was with an executive MBA class that met in 3-hour increments. So we did all 4 exercises in one evening. And it was interesting and created some great dialogue. But rolling it out for an undergrad class that meets twice a week for 90 minutes necessitated breaking up the exercises. And kind of the happy discovery out of that was that sometimes it's just nice to allow space for the ideas and the reflection to stew for a little bit, or for things to be able to percolate up and then add to the conversation later on. So in terms of sequencing or timing, personally, I have found it a lot easier to begin with the meaning of leadership exercise as a starting point that generally creates a really nice foundation. But then the other exercises could probably be done in any sequence. And I'll let kind of Michelle and others jump in if they disagree with this or have had different experiences. And the great thing about some of the exercises is that, if you reflect on it once, you get some value out of it. But if you have a 16-week semester and you talk about meaning in the beginning in week 1, and then you circle back to it at the end, sometimes students have a powerful epiphany in understanding the extent to which semester. And that allows them to craft that narrative a little bit more in a more complex and more meaningful way. And Michelle has some great examples from the way she's taught it about how some of these exercises can play off of each other. I don't know if you want to add in, Michelle, at this point.
Sure. I guess speaking to Rachel's point, I really like to repeat the drawing exercise, at the very first class, what are we talking about here anyway? And what are people's assumptions about what leadership is kind of coming into the class? I highlighting that my 5-year-old son has ideas about leadership, they're formed very, very early. So I like to repeat that, but I also like to highlight pair the drawing exercise on day 1 with the leader meter. I think it's really, really helpful for students to realize that their understanding of themselves as leaders and their willingness to take on a leadership position or to informally act when called to is really very much dependent on how they view leadership. So if they think that leadership is something, if they draw Superman, for example, which people have, they often don't necessarily relate to that idea of a leader as someone that's superhuman. So that's not me. I'm not on a pedestal. So I like to unpack the empty space in the leader meter. So what would make you see yourself more as a leader? So maybe it's kind of breaking down some of those assumptions on, well, maybe a leader isn't always, superhuman, but maybe it's a process, or maybe there's other people involved and things like that. And I think that helps to kind of demystify leadership. So we talk a lot about, is there one person in your drawing? Or, is it a process that someone can enter into? Is it a collaborative, aspect of it? And so people that feel like, oh, I wasn't born a leader, can accept, I guess, a little bit more leadership if they unpack their definition. And then on the flip side, I think it also helps to highlight how it's potentially dangerous if someone has filled in their leader meter all the way, but has maybe a very command and control view of what leadership is. Leadership is telling somebody what to do, and I'm 100% that. Well, that, what would it be like to work for somebody like that? So I think it's really nice to kind of unpack those elements of a leader identity and talk about how they're interplay together. And one of the other things that I like to talk about is the interplay of leadership and followership with this as well. So if you see more collaborative drawings, I like a flock of geese in a V, where they rotate who is in the front leading. That good leadership involves good followership at times. And then things like listening or stepping back or empowering become an opportunity to engage in leadership rather than a threat to leadership or a threat to their leader identity. So kind of pairing those two activities, I think, leads to a lot of kind of discussion around those ideas.
That's terrific. And again, those ideas of what leaders are goes back to that the very personal nature of some of the identity work that you're talking about. And so I could see the hesitancy of students to engage in a lot of that work. So, which is why I think this is a terrific approach to doing it. And these exercises are so valuable. But I'm wondering if getting started with the drawing exercise, what kind of reactions do you get? Do you get much hesitance there what do you mean you're asking me to draw out people? I can't draw. What are you talking about? Especially with, maybe MBA students or folks who have been around a little while longer. Well, how do you disarm that? What have you done there to get around that, to get the whole thing going?
I guess I'll run with that, and everyone jump in. It is unusual, especially with a master's level course, for example, to start out by drawing. There are sometimes some questions around, really, you're asking me to do this. And so it is kind of fun to just, I actually think I learned this from watching Michelle do it with some of her groups, is just simply to start out by saying, look, we all have in our minds an idea of what leadership is. And sometimes words can constrain what that is. So let's draw, and the directions are, draw what good leadership looks like to you. So, and it allows, and then you simply set up, we're not asking you for something that is artistic. No judgment if there are stick figures. You do whatever you need to do to capture just the image in your mind and not worry about the words. Don't let the words constrain you. And you give people a moment, but I think the other thing that helps break it down is, before we ask them to put words to their own drawings, and I believe we included this slide in the article in the appendix, we like to show a slide of a series of drawings, and as a group to just talk through what those represent. So then interpret it and then explain it. And usually it goes straight to explanation, and I'll say, well, hold on, let's describe first what you're seeing, and then let's interpret, and then let's explain. And they get that piece. And then they walk away from that realizing, I see why we're doing this. It actually is a great segue into talking about implicit leadership theories and the importance of those. And I'm now talking too much, so I'm going to let somebody else add in from here. Anyone else wants to say how they're doing it?
I like to point to the fact that this exercise is not something that's new. It's been used in executive training. It's one way that researchers have found that people tend to have, particularly in drawings, more male. If they illustrate a gender, typically it's more male-dominated leadership drawings. So I try to just present the activity as something that management consultants and people in leadership development programs have been using with executives over the past decade, to kind of take away this idea that leadership is specific people and get to the actual behaviors. And that seems to break down some of those issues. And I do think it's funny, a lot of our students will say, we're in business, we're not in the art department. But it's also an interesting way to find your students' hidden talents, because I have come across people who have incredible artistic ability, and that's always kind of another fun icebreaker the first day or so of class, to get to know who our students are.
That's neat. That's neat. Michelle or Mike, you have anything you'd like to add to that, or?
Sure. I mean, there's always groans, like, so I kind of laugh at that with them, so I think you're like, if you play along with it, it sort of helps to lighten the mood a little bit. And it is like nice on a first day, an icebreaker type of thing. And then I usually just highlight that I can't draw either. and some sort of shared vulnerability, I think, kind of helps set the stage a little bit better. And, it's good for you. Just do it. And then you don't have to show anyone. So that's, that's something that helps a bit.
That's terrific. That's terrific. Gretchen, I really like that you mentioned that this is not necessarily a new exercise. I mean, and that highlights another strength of this article, I think, is the bringing together of several of these tools to teach leadership, but in a theoretically grounded and integrative way. And so major kudos to you guys for that. It was another thing I really enjoyed about the work. I just have one more question, but before I do, I want to remind participants, other session participants, if you have a question, please do type it out in the chat box, and I'll ask that for you so that we can manage kind of the editing around the podcast recording. So my final question is kind of around lessons learned since the publication of this article. It was published in 2019 and in the first issue, I believe, of that volume. So it's been several semesters, including some problematic semesters, or at least one with COVID-19. I'm wondering what sort of, how these exercises have evolved, or what some of those lessons learned since then. If you could share any of those.
Absolutely. First of all, I was extremely fortunate to be on sabbatical this past semester, so I did not have to readily adapt everything, although my institution is going to be fully online this summer and fall, so I'm doing the work, just not in the midst of already teaching. But one of the activities that I've struggled with, I'm sorry, that's my cat, just jumped 12 feet into the air. So I apologize for that. Anyway, one of the problems, not really a problem, but a challenge that I've had is the 20 statements with the idea of levels of identity. I will sometimes have students get on a train of thought, and they will just list out different roles they have without necessarily those being leadership roles. So they see all of these open spaces, and they think, oh, I have to fill them all up. So, okay, well, I'm a daughter, and I'm a sister, and I'm a niece, and I'm a cousin. So they have all of these things that are all kind of similar types of roles. So a lot of times I have to redirect them. And so I've started at the beginning to steer them towards, I want you to think about your leadership behaviors, the different types of leadership behaviors that you exhibit or that seem available to you. And then think about what role you're playing when you're using those leadership behaviors. Because what we're really trying to get at is, are you using things that are very trait-like? Are you using behaviors that are very relationship-oriented? Or are you using things that are meant to instill and inspire followers? And that kind of gets at the individual level, the relationship level, or the collective level. So I've really had to craft my message around that particular activity. So my goal is to try to get them to think of different types of behaviors to show how well-rounded they might be, or to maybe illustrate they're only using individual level traits. So I'll throw it over to Mike and let him talk about maybe some more challenges.
Yeah, this has been kind of a neat one. It's funny, Michelle and I have been doing a qualitative study based in the same stuff where we're interviewing leaders that have a leadership role at work and in some sort of a volunteer organization. And so all the participants self-selected in on the basis of, we need people that lead at work and in a volunteer organization. And yet what we found is with a good number of them, we'll ask them the question, what's your definition of leadership? And they'll talk about it. And then we'll ask them something along the lines of, and to what extent do you see yourself as a leader? And like, well, on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm like a 6. Like, oh, why is that? And the answer in some form is basically, here's my definition of leadership, but I'm not a leader like that. That's not me. I don't do that. and sometimes it's sort of a perceived deficiency in themselves, and other times it's more of a, I really think leadership perhaps is very directive, command and control, but that's not my style. And once we kind of picked up on this, we started noticing it also in the exercises that we were doing, is a lot of time there's a disconnect in a healthy way between that picture that they draw of what is my concept of leadership, and usually in the leader meter, to what extent am I a leader? When you start asking people that you know are very accomplished leaders, right? You know from knowing them in class or having read their, their resume, some of the most accomplished leaders are filling up that leader meter like halfway. And when you ask them, what's the open space at the top? What would fill that up, or what would you need to be doing or experiencing or whatever to move that up? And it's usually something about, I don't enact my own idea of what leadership is. And that leads to some really, really cool conversations about the nature of leadership, and how we see ourselves as leaders, and how that actually can vary according to the domain that we're operating in. So we first kind of came at this as sort of, leader is a unique role. It's a unique identity because it cuts across different domains. It's one that you kind of take with you at work, at home, with your friends, when you're volunteering. But it's more nuanced than that. And when we start getting into some of those nuances, because these exercises prompt that, that's where the good stuff is.
Yeah, I'll speak a little bit more to that too, especially among the importance of dialogue. I think, certainly individuals can go through these exercises by themselves. And this has implications, I think, especially right now as we move to an online environment. So you definitely could walk students through these individually, but to me, the main benefit of this is the dialogue that happens, and realizing that, people have different understandings and expectations and assumptions about themselves, about others, about their leaders. So that dialogue is really, really important. And sort of to that, in this online environment, one of the things I had started last semester, and will definitely continue on in the fall, is creating small groups of students, and this worked really well at the MBA level. Small groups of students who, it's not a group project, but rather they're more like a peer coaching group where they go through these exercises and then some others, like we did the Total Leadership book of Stu Friedman, together in this context. So I had discussion forums that were, just for each individual group, where they went through and shared these in those spaces. And that worked really well for most groups, I should say. So there were a handful that they didn't connect. But I definitely will keep these exercises grounded in a discussion forum going forward online.
So we do have an audience question from Dave Fearon that I think actually kind of gets to the heart of this multi-domain approach to leadership. And here's his question. How about the idea that leadership is also a personal practice that is exercised daily and constantly within the main named practices our leaders do or will do? Leading as a way of getting one's own things done in any social context. Do any of the authors want to respond to Dave's question?
I'll have a go. Thank you for this question. I think it's really relevant to some of the things that, or the impetus of the article in the first place, which is that leadership is not a role, it is a practice, right? And this is why it does transcend the many domains of our lives. And there are so many opportunities by recognizing that it is something that's practiced. And in that practice of it, I think, Nick, you had raised the issue of it's really easy to take an arm's length approach to understanding leadership, but that does not translate into practice necessarily. And so what kind of service are we delivering to our students if they sit through a semester-long class and all we've done is give them theories, but no methods by which to reflect on their practice of leadership? So, there are a few articles out there about the necessity to humanize leadership education, and we really saw this as, well, this and you do find that students go through these exercises and come back after a week or a month, and they're starting to notice their daily practice, and they're coming back and they're sharing that. And so I think some of the things that Michelle has set up with the groups gives a great forum by which the students can start to, these reflection activities are just the starting point of reflection, but they really do prime a continuation over the course of the semester. So thank you for the question.
Terrific. Dave is, for maybe captioning purposes on the audio, Dave is celebrating the response. So we have another question from Mary Grace Neville. And her question is, the command control perception of leadership is the biggest challenge I face teaching internationally, especially true for hierarchical countries. How might we teach more teachers to think from the paradigm of your article and work? And have you tried to teach peer teachers? So maybe looking beyond the wonderful, award-winning now JME article, how might we teach teachers to take this approach in teaching leadership?
I can kind of talk to the first part of the question there. I think we can all identify with that. Particularly teaching international students or teaching internationally, coming from cultures that are more hierarchical in nature. Interestingly, I've had some of the best conversations. Right, at RIT, we happen to have a good number of students from Saudi Arabia, men and women. And it's actually been the Saudi women that have enhanced this conversation the most, right? So I'm coming from a very traditional hierarchical culture. And yet there's sort of a, I was going to say shadow economy, but that's not right. But there's, right, in the Saudi economy, everything happens that happens in every economy. It's segmented in places. And as they have evolved over the last couple of years, it's some really interesting conversations about what does this mean, because there's sort of obviously a very traditional hierarchical command and control structure, and that's sort of the official leadership structure. But then here's story after story after story of, then there's the unofficial structure, the workarounds and the ones that everybody knows about but nobody talks about. So it's this really rich juxtaposition between what we formally think and what we actually do in many situations. I don't know what the solution is, but it's been helpful.
Yeah, I'll add to that a little bit. I think one of the things that is really helpful is to highlight how there's a lot of different approaches to leadership that build on each other. And there are probably times when a command and control is really useful. The fire alarm goes off in the classroom, we have to get everybody out immediately. But that in it itself isn't necessarily wrong, but it's very limited. So highlighting that, yes, that's great in some instances, but where might that not work? And maybe that's really speaking to, to some of Mike's, so command and control served well during COVID, it came up, right? In some cases, and in others not. So I think it's really a building upon rather than a replacing, if that makes sense. Either like Draft's knowledge principles highlight that we build on these principles rather than getting rid of one of them, if that makes sense.
And then I'll just take the last part of that question. I actually was set to do a train the trainer type of session at WHAM this year in March. And of course it got canceled the week before. But I think that's also one of the ways, by participating in teaching conferences, by letting people know about the work, and just trying to make use of personal development workshops. When and if we return to in-person conferences, but also doing sessions like this to just let people know that this is out there, and the four of us are are continuing to hone these exercises, and we're happy to share the materials and our experiences and kind of disseminate that to the larger community.
That's terrific. I hope we have more of these kinds of sessions, more sessions from each of you at this conference, certainly in the future, and more PDWs and the like elsewhere too. To Rachel's point earlier, as a response to, I think it was Rachel's point earlier, as a response to this call for humanizing management education, calling on the whole individual and learning from that. It is fantastic. I really enjoyed reading this article, and I've enjoyed our conversation today. I don't see other questions from participants about the article itself, some logistics questions, which we may cover here in just a minute. But I just want to thank each of you, Michelle and Rachel and Mike and Gretchen, for coming today and joining this conversation, for your work on the article and for what is to come next. So thank you guys so much. It's been a lot of fun for me, and I hope it's been fun for you too. Thank you.
Oh.
Absolutely. Yes, thank you so much. Really fun.
Yeah.
We're so honored to have been awarded the Roethlisberger Award. It really was a nice bit of good news in the middle of a pretty terrible pandemic.
That's wonderful. I also want to thank Kevin Lowe again and all the members of the review committee. They had to review 24 really great articles published or 28 rather, articles published in JME last year. And select an honoree. And so a huge thanks to Kevin. I know that was not an easy work. And I want to thank the folks who submitted questions, the participants who submitted questions for these authors, and really all the participants for joining us today. I hope you also enjoyed the session as much as I did. This article was published in volume 43, issue 1 of the Journal of Management Education. And you can find that article and all the JME articles online at jme.sagepub.com, where you can also find additional Journal of Management Education podcasts. So again, thank you to everyone for joining. Hopefully you'll continue to engage in this article, this podcast and recording, and many of the others found on the website. So that will conclude the kind of formal portion of this. I'm happy to continue to kind of host this space for more dialogue if you'd like. For folks to kind of chime in. I know there were a couple of other questions just about accessing the article, maybe that concluding bit did that, but for every participant, you are registered for the conference, and online access to all of MOBTS publications is provided as part of that registration fee and membership. So if you don't have institutional access, you can go to the MOBTS.org website and get JME and MTR access there, along with all of the supplemental stuff. So the appendices that I think maybe Michelle and Rachel and others mentioned in a few responses. So if you have other questions, I'm happy to take them about those kind of logistics. But if not, we can go our separate ways, or continue just to kind of to hang out for a bit. I know we have 10 more minutes left in the session, but I'm open to either one. So.
Yeah, I wanted to say too, if we're definitely available. We have some ideas, so if anyone is struggling to figure out how this might work in an online environment or more insights, so feel free to reach out to any one of us.
And I would just like to say on behalf of JME, thank you for sending your work to us. We're really pleased to have been able to both publish it and to recognize it for its excellence and practicality in this area. So thank you.
Thank you.
The only disappointing thing for me was that I read this article first just after delivering a global leadership development course. And I would have much rather have read it just before delivering, because I would have used some of the work in the global leadership context. Very cool. So next fall, I guess it's this coming fall, whenever, I'll be teaching that class, I think.
Nicholas, I used this. San Jose State is part of a consortium with 11 other MBA programs. So I've even taken some of the exercises and specified, how do you use this in your home country? How do you, is there a difference? So I've even had them do the leadership drawings of how do you think Americans illustrate leadership? How do South Africans illustrate leadership? And that also, like from a global leadership perspective, that adds a whole other domain on top of their, individual life domains. So it does get really rich. So next time you do it.
That's right. Next time I can do that. I will, in teaching global leadership class, use the, I think it's Myers HBR Navigating Cultural Minefield. And there's a little exercise on HBR's website about how you line up with your home country context as far as averages and these different cultural dimensions. And that would be kind of another neat addition to kind of do together those differences. Really cool.
It would also be interesting to explore in the narrative how cultural identity interacts with leader identity. I mean, maybe a cultural identity is another piece that transcends work, life, community. And, it's so powerful, right? Culture is just such a driver of so much that we do. What a fun thought exercise that would be to think about how culture drives our meaning of leadership. So in some work I've done in cultural self-awareness has been to kind of explore some of assumptions that we have and to underline how many of those like values that you have are driven by your culture. And that often becomes how many are driven by your culture, how many are driven by your family. There's a lot of other things that drive the types of values that we have. I can send that to you.
It'd be great. Great. Thank you guys too for doing this. Was kind of a twofer where we could do the session and the podcast, and really appreciate your willingness to do that.
It was fun.
Was fun.
Was it Catherine Pavlovich who was the AE on your article? It was Catherine. Yeah, Catherine Pavlovich. Yes. We try to acknowledge the AEs who work with authors through the review process.
Yeah.
On award-winning articles.
Well, and I actually the review process. We certainly in rounds of reviews got some feedback that was extremely helpful for the development of the paper. Particularly, naturally you include your learning objectives in your course syllabus, but then when we got the feedback, what are the learning objectives for these? It was kind of nice to map things much more cohesively to. These are the exercises that get at these particular learning objectives, and here's the evidence. I think one thing that we didn't put in our original version, which was fun to go back and grab, was the qualitative evidence that speaks to the effectiveness of the exercises. And that was a lot of fun.
Nice reminders, isn't it? That's nice reminders that you're doing good work. It's great.
Yeah.
Ellen has a question over in the chat. Do you have suggestions for how to use the leadership illustration exercise with an all-female group? And really quickly, Ellen, you asked about an overview of the exercises, or a brief overview of the exercises. It was actually the first question we asked. So the whole podcast will be recorded and on the JME website, and I think Brandon is also recorded the video. So there will be that there. But what do you guys think about? Have you had any experience with that? And if not, what do you think that experience might look like?
I actually have. There was one man in the class and then me as the instructor, but the rest I was about 15 women in that particular class. It was pretty much the same. I mean, same responses, same things. You may have had Superwoman instead of Superman a bit more, but didn't notice a whole lot of difference.
One of the things I'm going to try this semester is to actually try to have the students go even further than like how they see leadership, but also maybe things they hear, like to try to, I don't know how it'll work, but do they hear a leader who kind of bangs on a desk and is loud and forceful with the way they speak, or do they hear a leader as someone who's more asking for consultation and advice? So I'm going to try to like make it more than just like what's the image in your mind, but what also like to try to get into some other sensory ideas to maybe make it even more tangible. And I think that would also be interesting to see the difference from a female versus a male perspective, or obviously different cultures.
I worked with a PhD student. I used to work at the University of Limerick in Ireland, and she did her PhD on kind of applying some of these principles in the context of a leadership development program that ended up, it wasn't intentionally, but ended up being all women. And we wrote an article that's forthcoming now about some of the risks associated with identifying as a leader, so sort of assuming a leader identity. And so I'm curious if some of these things kind of come up. So Ellen, get back to me after you do this and let me know about one was around the responsibility, right? There's just too much responsibility. I don't want to take ownership for everything. What if it fails and then I'm left, with this because I'm not Superman. And another one was around kind of breaking the stereotype of the culture's, the organization's culture's view of leadership. So it may be interesting kind of as Gretchen's activity around, what's your country's sort of stereotype or implicit theories of leadership, but what is your organization's, and how does that conflict or not with your own sort of gender identity, which I think is really interesting there. So yeah, I don't know that the practice of the exercises will be that different, but it may be interesting to kind of talk about that. Well, what are some of these risks that might show up in that? So.
Yeah, and thank you so much. I'm really curious to use this. This has given me so many great ideas. We usually, just a quick 2-second context. I do work with technical women, so women in STEM fields, and that works interesting. We cover topics around emotional intelligence, self-awareness, leadership styles, which was brought up, and then this other group I was just thinking about, and what I'm learning today is like it's more of a half-day workshop with over 200 women representing all different fields in an organization. And the groups, it's like an affinity group called Lead by Women, but there are also men in the group. So I was thinking of ways to engage them. It's all on Zoom. So the way I would normally do it in the classroom, I have to rethink, as we all do. So having them draw it out is interesting. I was curious, Mike or Michelle, any of you, Mike, when you mentioned like some of what they might draw, I'm curious if you find that women draw male leader figures or images. Or Gretchen, Michelle, or anybody, but yeah, Rachel.
I'd say the vast majority are androgynous stick figure like things. So, it's more at that level. It's a lot of stick figures doing different things.
Okay.
One holding up other ones, or one leading the charge, or one holding hands with it's a lot of those kind of things. But the slide that we use, which has a number of different things, there's one sort of with a generic, uncopyrighted Superman. That usually sparks a bit of discussion. Mm-hmm. Where I do see it sometimes is even from women is using masculine pronouns in talking about leadership or what a leader would do, and it's very interesting. Just I don't know. I just find that very interesting. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with what Mike said. And I have on occasion in a classroom setting just done a little tally of the he's and she's. just to point that out and kind of get the discussion around that going. Yeah.
It kind of, that fits with Gretchen, part of what you were making me think about of what do we hear? What do we hear them saying in addition to what do they do, but also what are we hearing in how they describe those behaviors? Yeah. Thank you so much again for your generosity. Congratulations to everybody, but it's really helpful to be able to learn from you and apply it. So thank you.
Good luck as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ellen. All right, it is now 12:31, so I think, at least on my computer. So we better give up this meeting space so Brandon can usher in whoever comes next, I guess. But again, thank you guys so much. Really appreciate it. Thanks, Ellen, and others for the questions. And hopefully I will see each of you next year at Pomona, I guess. Yeah, at MOBTS and Pomona. So.